everyone, welcome. We are going to read the next part of Esio Trot by Roald Dahl. We're going to learn a few more vocabulary words. We're going to make sure we know what's happening. And we're going to learn about italics. So we're doing a reading lesson, improving our vocabulary, enjoying the story, and learning about this word italics. Okay, let's go. So do you remember, so far in the story, we have met our friend Mr. Hoppy, who lives on the balcony above Mrs. Silver. Mr. Hoppy is secretly in love with Mrs. Silver, but she loves little Alfie the tortoise. Now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. He was leaning over his balcony rail, watching Mrs. Silver serving Alfie his breakfast. "Oh, here's the heart of the lettuce for you, my lovely," she was saying, "and here's a slice of fresh tomato and a piece of crispy celery." "Good morning, Mrs. Silver," Mr. Hoppy said. "Alfie's looking well this morning." "Oh, isn't he gorgeous?" Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming at him. "Absolutely gorgeous," Mr. Hoppy said, not meaning it. And now, as he looked down at Mrs. Silver's smiling face, gazing up at his own, he thought for the 1000th time how pretty she was, how sweet and gentle and full of kindness, and his heart ached with love. "I do so wish he would grow a little faster," Mrs. Silver was saying. "Every spring, when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And do you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces. That's almost nothing." "What does he weigh now?" Mr. Hoppy asked her. "Just 13 ounces, Mrs. Silver answered. "About as much as a grapefruit." "Yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers," Mr. Hoppy said solemnly, "but they can live for 100 years. "Oh, I know that," Mrs. Silver said, "but I do so wish he would grow just a little bit bigger. He's such a tiny wee fellow." "Oh, he seems just fine as he is," Mr. Hoppy said. "No, he's not just fine," Mrs. Silver cried. "Try to think how miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up." "You really would love him to grow bigger, wouldn't you?" Mr. Hoppy said, and even as he said it, his mind suddenly went click, and an amazing idea came rushing into his head. "Of course I would," Mrs. Silver cried. "I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy." Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel. Here, surely was his big chance. "Grab it," he told himself. "Grab it quick." "Mrs. Silver," he said, I do actually happen to know how to make tortoises grow faster, if that's what you really want." "You do?" she cried. "Oh, please tell me. Am I feeding him the wrong things?" "I worked in North Africa once," Mr. Hoppy said. That's where all these tortoises in England come from, and a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret. Tell me, cried Mrs. Silver. I beg you to tell me, Mr. Hoppy. I'll be your slave for life. When he heard the words, your slave for life, a little shiver of excitement swept through Mr. Hoppy. Wait there, he said. I'll have to go in and write something down for you. Okay, well, let's go through it for any more unusual words. Okay, so now we come to a certain bright morning in May when something happened that changed and indeed electrified Mr. Hoppy's life. This word here, electrified. And when something electrified Mr. Hoppy's life, well, electricity is a kind of energy. So it means something happened that put a lot of energy and excitement, that put a spark into Mr. Hoppy's life. And then at the bottom it says, Mrs. Silver was looking up and beaming at him. And beaming means she was giving him a really big, friendly smile. And then when they're talking a little bit later, Mrs. Silver says, do you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he has not gained more than 3 ounces? Well, you might not know what ounces are, but an ounce, up here it says, an ounce is an old measurement of weight, and 3 ounces is not very much at all. It's about the weight of a really extra small apple. And then a little bit later on, Mr. Hoppy is really trying to make Mrs. Silver feel better. He says, yes, well, tortoises are very slow growers, Mr. Hoppy said solemnly. So, solemnly is a word that means in a very serious way. And Mrs. Silver weighs him on the kitchen scale, so scale's what we use to weigh things. And then she says, but he's such a tiny wee fellow. So you probably know the word tiny, meaning very, very small, but wee, a tiny wee fellow, that means he's extra small. Wee is actually a Scottish word, meaning very small. He's a wee fella. Tiny wee fellow. And fellow is a word meaning man. He's a very small little boy, or very small little man. Okay, and Mrs. Silver says, just try to imagine, try to think how miserable it must make him feel. And miserable is a word meaning really sad. How miserable it must make him feel to be so titchy. Everyone wants to grow up. And miserable means very sad, really completely sad. And titchy is a word meaning very small or really tiny. And if we look at this paragraph here, of course I would, Mrs. Silver cried. I'd give anything to make it happen. Why, I've seen pictures of giant tortoises that are so huge people can ride on their backs. If Alfie were to see those, he'd turn green with envy. Well, that's actually quite funny because when we say someone would turn green with envy, it's a way of saying they'd be very jealous. He'd really want to be like them. Really jealous. But, of course, Alfie is already green, isn't he? Because he's a tortoise. And a tortoise shell is green. So he can't actually turn green with envy because he's already green. And I thought you'd be interested to know that there have been some eccentric people who have collected giant tortoises, and one of the famous ones was a man called Walter Rothschild from the famous banking family, the Rothschilds. And he was very, very rich. He had a big zoo, and he collected these huge Galapagos tortoises. And they were so big and strong that he could actually get on them and ride them. Although I don't think it probably was very good for the tortoises. He was also a very eccentric man, and we can see in this picture here that he had this horse and carriage, only I can see the carriage, but instead of horses, he had 4 zebras that he used to use to pull him around London in the 1890s. So there we are. Now, Mr. Hoppy's mind was spinning like a flywheel, and a flywheel is a kind of wheel that you will see inside engines and motors that turn very, very fast. And then Mr. Hoppy says, I worked in North Africa once, Mr. Hoppy said. That's where all these tortoises in England come from. And a Bedouin tribesman told me the secret of how to make tortoises grow faster. And the Bedouin tribesmen, the Bedouin are real people, the Bedouin, and they are a group of people who traditionally lived as nomads. So they would travel through the deserts and the dry lands of North Africa and the Middle East. So countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So traditionally they wear these long robes and head scarves to keep the heat off them. Okay. So one of the things in our lesson today is to learn about italics. So can you see that sometimes some of the words in a text are written in a different sloping style called italics? So italics, and you can always tell when words are written in italics because the letters look like they are leaning over. Can you see? The L here is not going straight up and down, but it's leaning slightly over. And we put words into italics when we're writing, when we're typing, to tell the reader that those words are extra important. And we must make them sound more important when we read them aloud. So I've got the same sentence 3 times, and I've put a different word in italics each time. So the sentence is, I love chocolate, said Alex. But hear the difference. So in this first sentence, I put the word love in italics. Can you see it sloping over? It sounds different. We've got to read it like this. I love chocolate, said Alex. Do you hear? I love chocolate, said Alex. Okay, so the love is in italics. I love chocolate. What about this next bit? The next sentence. Well, can you see which word is in italics here? It's chocolate, isn't it? So hear how it sounds different. It's got to be like this. I love chocolate, said Alex. Did you hear how it's different? I love chocolate. So we're giving it extra emphasis. And in the last sentence, can you spot which of the words is in italics? Oh, here it is. I. So now the sentence is like this. I love chocolate, said Alex. I love chocolate, said Alex. So when we read the words in italics, we've got to give them that extra importance, and we can use a slightly different kind of voice, extra emphasis. So here we have a paragraph from the text. Can you spot which words are in italics? So pause the video. Which words are in italics? Okay, well, I do so wish he would grow a little faster. That's in italics, Mrs. Silver was saying. Every spring when he wakes up from his winter sleep, I weigh him on the kitchen scales. And do you know that in all the 11 years I've had him, he's not gained more than 3 ounces? That's in italics. And then she finishes off, she says, that's almost nothing. So those words are in italics, those words that are leading over. And remember that we need to read them with that extra emphasis, making them sound like the most important words in the sentence. And they will often have some extra meaning or extra emotion behind them. And I think that here, these words show that Mrs. Silver is just desperate for it to happen. The italics show how much Mrs. Silver wants these things. So the words are in italics or italicized to show that that's what she really, really wants. I do so wish he would grow a little faster. He's not gained more than 3 ounces. She's frustrated. That's a very small amount for 11 years. That's almost nothing. So it's showing her strong emotions and what she really wants. And here we have it. Some more words in italics. No, he's not just fine, Mrs. Silver cried. And those italics might mean that she said it a bit louder, and the clue is perhaps in cried. No, he's not just fine. Extra emphasis. And this is how italics work, and it's important when we read aloud and when we read somebody else's work and we see italics, we've got to think that person wants us to know these are the very important words in the sentence. So we've got to pay extra attention to them. Now, I have uploaded a short, this is the text that we've been reading, and some comprehension questions, and at the end it asks you to explain in your own words why you might use italics when you are writing. So, looking forward to seeing all your work. Bye guys!